Welcome to the program. I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. D.W. Gibson here with us. 14 Miles, Building the Border Wall, his new book from Simon & Schuster. How's it going, man?
Good. Thanks for having me.
You got it. So this book is fascinating to me on a number of different levels. I mean, just kind of looking into the history of our relationship with the border. Obviously, President Trump's fascination with the border going back to when he was a presidential candidate. And then, of course, the actual people involved with building the wall and the people who are walking by it and all that. So what was it like jumping into this book, and what piqued your interest the most?
Yeah, what piqued my interest was this idea that I noticed about us, that we like to draw lines to define ourselves. I worked on a book about gentrification and how a city changes when a bunch of money comes to town. And when I talked to people about that book, I noticed again and again this idea of the lines we draw defining ourselves coming up again and again, whether it was wrong side of the tracks kind of idea, to I only stay on this block, I only go to this part of town, or even some more more figurative ideas of lines like language and ethnicity that we use to define ourselves. So I decided, what better line to visit to look at this part of our society than the border between Mexico and the U.S. Just because it had been so much a part of our political discussions, cultural discussions, Thanksgiving dinner discussions, and I wanted to go right to the epicenter and see what it was like for the people who actually live there.
That's a really great point about drawing lines, or even just putting people in boxes in general. What was the biggest surprise once you got going with this, and all the different people you talked to? What really blew your mind the most?
Man, I talked to so many people that really made me think about borders in a different way. A couple of good examples. Stan Rodriguez, who's part of the Kumeyaay tribes there, and their land, the traditional land, straddles the border. So about half of it is in the U.S. and half of it is in Mexico. And he really sort of just made me think about borders in an entirely different sense, in that he talked about hundreds of years of history the Kumeyaay have endured after the thousands of years they had already been in place, right? So they had Spanish come and divide up their land. They had Mexico come, divide up their land, and eventually the U.S. came and divided up their land. And they're still there. And Stan said to me, borders, they aren't static. We like to think of them as static, but they are not static. They've been changing over time. And that really stood out to me, just in terms of being able to think about a border in a different way. Another good example is Serge Dedina, the mayor of Imperial City, a small city right up against the border, right there at the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. And he talked about borders being a magnet, this place where people come together to collaborate, to solve problems. He's dealing with so much water pollution from the Tijuana River estuary going out into the Pacific Ocean. He works with Mexican authorities, all kinds of government agencies to solve that problem. But he talks about all the business and all the life that sort of is drawn to the border. And I think that's a wonderfully disruptive way to think about the border. Not this line that divides, but this magnet that attracts people to collaboration.
That's really fascinating, because the people you just mentioned, we don't necessarily think about those people in the everyday conversations about the border. It very much becomes the people in Washington, very much becomes about policy. The great irony is the people that you write about are the ones actually being affected the most by what we're talking about here. So what was it like kind of peeling back the irony where it's these people are living with it every single day, yet it's groups of people who are fighting about it over Thanksgiving dinner, or people in Washington that are fighting about it that will never actually encounter the true impact of the border?
Yeah, I mean, for example, I met a woman named Aurelia who lived, I was studying the prototypes, right? So you might remember 2 years ago, they built in the fall of 2017, 8 prototypes for a border wall in the desert of Otay Mesa. And that's what a lot of the action of the book follows. And Aurelia lives in Las Torres, or she lived in Las Torres, a neighborhood in Tijuana, about 200 feet from the prototypes. Definitely the person living closest to them. She's an American citizen. She was born in Ventura, California. Her father was a Mexican, got deported, and she went back to Mexico when she was a young child with her father, and is having trouble getting back into the U.S. Doesn't have all the documentation. She has her birth certificate, but not her social security card, and is trying to get all that documentation and find a way to get back into the U.S. And so that just shows you right there that complication, that U.S. citizen sort of not only living in the shadow of the prototypes, but not having access to the city where she was born. Just one example, but so many people think about the border in very different ways and interact with it in different ways. I think we obsess about border patrol and the idea of people, patrolling the border, but really so much of the action is at ports of entry. And you talk to people who live at the border, they're sick of 4-hour waits to get in to the country, going either way, whether you're a student who lives in Tijuana, going to school in San Diego. And also all of the crime that's interdicted at the border is often interdicted at the ports of entry. So a lot of people talk about that live near the border want to see more ports of entry, making them more accessible, flow more freely and more securely.
Yeah, there's so many deeper layers to it, and yet some people just boil it down to 14 miles, $147 million, and clearly your book shows more. So what don't we talk enough about when it comes to this conversation about the border?
I think the thing we don't talk enough about is how capitalism sort of factors into this, right? So we had the NAFTA agreement, which has been rewritten now, and it gives us all of these factories in northern Mexico, right on the border, maquiladora as they're called. And a lot of American brands, international brands do manufacturing there, and they get less expensive labor, they get to skip out on duties and taxes, and they get to bring those products into the US to sell to American consumers. And the thing that really stood out to me that we don't talk enough about is how freely cheap products flow across the border, but people who make those products possible can't flow across the border. I think it'd be great if we could talk more about finding a way to honor the people that make those cheap products possible as much as we honor those cheap products. I think that's something we're missing here.
That's an
And I think
excellent
it's about
point.
honoring the workers too, right? That goes
Right.
outside of citizenship. That goes to people busting their tail every day at their job, no matter where they come from.
Yeah, just looking at the human side of it, we focus on the economic side of it. These products benefit this country, but we like to forget all about the people. And I think that's messed up. And clearly you point that out. And I think it's going to be interesting because obviously 2020, there's so much to think about. But coming into November, what does Border Patrol security look like if Donald Trump is reelected? What does that mean if Joe Biden becomes president? Have you let your mind wander to the future of this conversation, even though there's so much to think about these days?
I have, yeah. I mean, you could play out all kinds of different scenarios, right? I think one thing that really stood out to me is in a post 9/11 world, that was really sort of a line in the sand where everyone, politically speaking, got behind the idea of border security. I think it was a little misguided because the southern border really had nothing to do with 9/11. In fact, a few of the hijackers came in through Canada. We never really talked about that border at all. But post 9/11, we got folded into this idea of border security being a national security issue. And I think that Democrats and Republicans alike talk about that and vote for that. I mean, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have all voted for border security packages in the past. So if that's where we've arrived, I think it would be great to think about security in a more expansive way. I think this is something that a Biden presidency might offer that a Trump presidency clearly doesn't. But the idea that security doesn't just mean sort of interdicting crime at the border, but it also means people feeling secure in the job they have, feeling secure in the home they have, feeling secure that they'll have food on the table. And so I think that idea of thinking about security more expansively as we think about securing the border is something we could do that would be helpful in a Biden administration moving forward. And I think with Trump, we would see a lot more of the same. More law enforcement, more money put towards barriers at the border, which have been shown to really not do a whole lot. I mean, the quickest way to show that point is I met a guy who runs a tunnel rat division from Border Patrol, and he goes and has to find all the tunnels buried in the earth. He's found tunnels 90 feet into the earth.
Wow.
There's no fence that goes 90 feet into the earth. So where there's a will, there's a way. Barriers only divert the traffic. They don't ever stop it.
And it's one of those problems that you can't just throw money on it and expect it to go away or expect it to be different. Like that's a perfect example. It's like there are many more things we have to do here before we can just say, hey, this is the price it's going to cost. And I think it's going to be interesting going forward to see how it actually happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that ties to like being neighborly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to a Tijuana police officer one day, and he was giving me a piece of his mind about the wall. And he said, fine, if you want to put up a wall, do it. I respect you. It's your right, right? But don't tell me it's because we're bad people. If you want it for privacy, do it. But don't tell me it's because we're bad. And I think we need to start sort of remembering that the Mexicans are our neighbors, and by extension, sort of Central Americans too, are in the region, our neighbors. And anything we can do to help stabilize those places is helpful to us too. And I think we have to understand too, we have a hand in the instability in that part of the world, right? We provide the market where drugs are sold.
Yeah.
We provide the guns that go south. So we have to own up to those parts of the problem and be more neighborly towards the countries that are around us.
You met some people that I think would categorize anybody coming over the border as the enemy. So what was it like dealing with those people? And, what was like the crazy experience? Because you had like a person from InfoWars, but like what really pops out all this time later?
Yeah, a couple of things. I met, Bob Maupin, who lived out in the desert of San Diego County. You think of coastal California, I think a lot of people do in terms of diehard Democratic right now, but you go inland and it's very different. And Bob has a had a 250-acre ranch right on the border. He would go out and patrol it every morning. And back in the day, in the 90s, he actually led small groups of vigilantes, his self-appointed word, to patrol the border and to find people crossing. And a big supporter of the wall. But so Bob, I think, has this more, if I can say, antiquated version of America, right? He wants to do away with the hyphenated America. No African Americans, no Italian Americans, just American American. But I think the thing we're confronting, especially now, is that we are this hybridization of the rest of the world. We really are, you know, and it's a struggle that we've faced throughout our trying to reckon with immigration policy. It mirrors, I think, some of the conversations we're having around policing right now. Like, just as an example, we went first 100 years as a country, 99 years to be exact, 99 years, no immigration laws, not one. First one in 1875, what does it do? It keeps Chinese women out of the country. And then a few years after that, the Chinese Exclusion Act kept all Chinese nationals out of the country. And you flash forward a few years after that, we get to national origins formula that prioritize Western Europeans coming into the country. So we've all, you know, you can see the narrative of our immigration law history, and it really is about maintaining the status quo and the white power we have in place. And I think that we're realizing that now, white America is realizing that, we're confronting that. And I think it's a good opportunity to change that narrative.
A lot of people don't like change, whether it's the border, policing, guns. They try and hold down to that precedent. But as you just mentioned, like, policy evolves over time. And for those people that are kind of stuck in antiquated America, there's a whole group of people trying to push America forward. But I think what we've learned in the past 4 years, DW, is that both of those people exist, and we shouldn't just grand sweep it to say, you know, America thinks one way about one issue. Like, it's clear with the border that we still have varying opinions on it, even in 2020.
Absolutely. And any conversation that can go past, you know, 7 minutes, you can talk to someone, and you really, if I could encourage everyone to think about the border in a different way, it would be about getting away from this binary. I'm for the wall, I'm against the wall. Very few people I met were so very singular. They had nuance. They struggled with facts in various ways. And so I think that the more we can allow for that nuance, the more we can allow for more imaginative ways of thinking about the border beyond that sort of stale binary, the more helpful it will be to all of us.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. It's much more than just the wall. DW, thanks so much, man. Looking forward to people checking out your book, and we'll talk to you down the road, all right?
Thanks for having me, man.